Hello everyone and welcome on my channel. Today we will make a tier list of factions. It's been a long time since the last patch comes. A number of tournaments have been played and we have an information about hotfix promised by CA at the end of this month, at the end of May. So let's see what we will have at this moment, and then after hotfix will come we will make a new video about how it will change finally. So let's look at screen and talk a little about how this shit work. Sure, first moment is faction tiers from S to C. The S tier, the most broken, imbalanced, recognized as the kings of meta. Usually it's one, maybe two factions, depends on current patch. The A1. Factions with the best situation by matchups, usually it's 3 or 4. Why this number? Because the most common format for tournaments like early stages, before semifinals or before final, sometimes semifinals and finals it's still best of 3, so the best of 3 format is most common format for tournaments. The A2 tier is the main number of meta factions, inferior to A1 only in the ratio of bad to good matchups and the comfort of use of these factions on usual tournament maps and in common tournament big band systems. B1, the same as A2 but just a little bit more predictable or with a little worse results in matchups against the main meta factions, or probably a little bit worse ratio of bad to good matchups. B2, factions which one do not enough strong to reach the full meta in one way or another, but are still playable, like on some maps, probably as counter picks, so they just playable but not really competitive. That's how we can call them. And the tier C, the true underdogs, clearly inferior to most of factions and usually have terrible statistic on matchups, so have more bad than good matchups, very predictable with weak roster or just nerfed by patch too hard, so this is just weak faction which one do not really playable on competitive level at the current time. Then you can see the 3 columns, the left one, the middle one and the right one. This 3 column will show a different playstyle factions. In the right one it will be factions with specific playstyle, like every one of them will have a specific one. The middle one is for factions who like formation, like use defensive formation and very dependent on units synergizing between each other. And in the left side it's more about chaotic kind of gameplay, about factions who like wide formation, like lot of separate little fights and have very good units for separate trade. Finally, we're ready to start the tier list, and only few last things I need to say. First of all, it's Domination tier list. So I'm not really experienced in land battles of third part. I played them a lot in second part of Warhammer, but I do not know current land battle meta now, so it's just Domination tier list. And another moment, it's just my opinion. This video does not claim to be the ultimate truth, it's just my personal opinion, so after you will watch this, welcome to comments to share with your own one, and let's start the tier list. And sure, we will start from the most broken faction, unexpectedly the last DLC faction, the Chaos Dwarves themselves. Sure, they are S tier, They have broken magic, like with spell who just delete units. Broken Astrogod, who is incredibly strong, while small entity, for some reason he can beat Be'lakor in duel, for example. That's just sick. And sure, most balanced part of their roster, the Pool Towers, the Magma Cannons, and the 150 cost unit of infantry who have a full capway. The next faction we will take a look will be one of the Chaos puppets, the Norska. In the current meta, they feel themselves great. The nerf almost did not affect them, and the famous over 1300 cost got a damage against large targets, so it can be called like a little buff. Together with nerf to their big brothers, Be'lakor, Warriors of Chaos, Slaanesh, all this faction a same playstyle, but was nerfed, and Norska now take a place in A1 tier as one of the best faction in the current time. Another Chaos puppets who was increase their performance in tournaments, the Beastmen, who just goes in A2 because, well, they have the same reasons to become stronger as Norskan one. They take better place in tier list after patch. They still do not enough strong to fight against 3 top factions, which one you will see in the final of this tier list. So while we're talking about Chaos puppets, let's find a place for little tricky Skaven. And I should say it's solid A2 tier for sure. In the current realities, especially with the use a bag for +8 leadership with the passive ability of Chieftain and possibility summon your lord from reinforcements as just full unit but not actual lord, the Skaven feels themselves good enough. But also they still have a lot of pretty hard matchups, so cannot be called as one of strongest. So after puppets, it's time for masters, the Chaos Warriors. One of the pretty questionable factions. I think most of peoples will rate them in B1 tier, cause last nerfs hit them pretty hard, but you know, it's still a Chaos Warriors with pretty big roster, with pretty lot of lords, so I personally would say that they should go in A2. Just for now, players should find new options, which ones they should use, like what marks can be good instead of Slaanesh marks, what lords can be used instead of Be'lakor, and after this, Chaos Warriors, I am sure, will return on tournaments as pretty common pick. Now we have seen few factions from the first part of the game, so let's continue with an Empire and another Order factions. Like many others, with nerfs of aggressive meta top factions, the Empire goes deeply in full meta and becomes really effective. Also, Empire still very dependent on a few units, so it can't be called one of the strongest, but it's still pretty solid. And because of the reason that Warriors of Sigmar are pretty popular, I think we will see Empire more and more often in future tournaments. And next we have another human faction, Bretonnia. After the change to the wage mechanic, the faction becomes way more interesting. However, this was still not enough for Bretonnia become fully competitive, but still it was very good increase of faction specific. But the last patch changed everything. It makes a radical change to the Grail Guardians and nerf few of the most problematic top factions for Bretonnia. So now Bretonians feel themselves pretty competitive. Okay, after the Knights of the Lady, let's talking about the Beer's Enjoyer. Actually nothing has changed for the dwarves, except the increase of monster infantry animations, what makes them much more effective against regular units of infantry. It's not the most pleasant news for dwarves, but otherwise dwarves remain as they were. Strong enough in some situation or against some faction, good on some maps, sometimes pretty annoying counterpick, but unfortunately they are nothing more. So just regular B tier. As well as Katai. In start Katai was weak, then got several buffs and gained some popularity, but now it's good in land battles, while in Domination Katai is almost never played in tournaments. Cause of simple reason. That faction do not have charm of underdog factions now, and at the same time do not effective enough to play in full meta stuff. Pretty predictable, so have no stuff to really surprise opponent as well. And the last order faction, Kislev, another faction who scored a few points, slightly strengthening the position. However, a strong depends on several units and poor roster makes Kislev very predictable, so do not allow the Beer Enjoyers feel themselves completely relevant near the another meta factions. After Kislev and Katai, it will be right decision to look at another factions of the third part, and let's start from the Slaanesh, the most heated factions by the patch. After the series of fairly moderate correct nerfs that almost make the faction balanced, the developers suddenly decided to just destroy it completely. So from S tier, maybe A1 on the previous patch, before all that happened, Slaanesh goes into very weak position and feel themselves almost unplayable in B2 tier. The second demonic faction, who now have a lot of troubles, is Charles Demons. Bellacor's signature faction raises more questions and has a better chance to being capable of something, because in addition to nerfs, it was affected by buffs to Nurgle Toads, as well as got decrease the cost of lords. But however, tournament results and my personal experience so far leave the Charles Legion at the level of Slaanesh for now. The Changers of Ways. Master Magic Tzeentch himself, almost unchanged in recent patch. The Lord of Change still has some good options in his roster, which gives him the opportunity to show at least some results, even if it's heavily dependent on maps and matchups. At the moment, it still can be used. And while demonic factions is struggle and try to bring some kind of tricky stuff to have a chance to win the game, Minotaurs of Khorne, as true children of the Blood God, are supposed to drag the Khorne faction on their mighty stopped backs into the ranks of acceptable races used on tournaments. But at the same time they show to all of us that without them, as well as without corny doggy good boys, whole Blood God faction probably will be dropped out into the unplayable C tier. Let's give a couple of time to the grandfather Nurgle, and let's go to discuss the Dark Elves. In general, nothing has changed for them. Malekith was nerfed a little bit, but it just means the popularity of the Dark Sorcerer pick was boosted and nothing more, because on Dragon she's way cheaper than Malekith, weaker in combat, but cheaper as well. So nothing changed. And you still can pick Malekith, he is still pretty relevant. But the strong nerfs of top factions allow to Dark Elves save their position in strong A2 tier. The next one is High Elves. The cost increase of the Lothern Seaguard was much less significant than hard nerfs of the top factions, so their position did not change much either, and we can call them probably the most average faction at this moment in terms of efficiency, so it is very difficult to determine them, and just for now let's give them a little bit higher position. And then move on to the Wood Brothers, the Wood Elves, one of the most unpopular factions in Domination at this moment, so it's very hard to rate them as well as High Elves, but with the reason that I almost do not see them, and the results which I see from people who main Wood Elves, I prefer to rate them in a little bit lower position, so they probably higher B1 or maybe A2, but I can't be sure. So that will be their position in my tier list for now. And the last faction of the second part, Lizardmen. For me that's the same story as with High Elves and Wood Elves, it's just pretty hard for me to rate them, but Lizardmen played a little bit more often in tournaments, so I think their results push them into position B1. Here I can be wrong as well, I'm pretty sure they are not A1, maybe A2, but it's like with High Elves, but I prefer to rate them a little bit lower than higher. Okay, let's return into the old world, and talking about Greenskin Boys, one of the best factions of the second part, they suffer from previous meta pretty hard, because they have troubles with single entities, with terrified units, especially Chad Be'lakor, and Warriors of Chaos, Slaanesh and Demons of Chaos themselves, so they struggle, they suffered from these three top factions. But now, all of these factions was nerfed pretty hard, and that means finally Orc Boar Boys begins and little angry hungry squeaks can dominate the battlefields, led by dreaded Ajax the Slaughterer, who finally caught his items. Sure, for now they still have some troubles against top factions, like current best 3-4 factions, pretty effective against Greenskin, but for now they feel themselves better than in any time of third part of Warhammer. So now, when we almost end with our tier list, it's time for Ogres, my lord. Ogres should say very big fat things for that fact of monsters infantry animations reworking. All of their roster now become much more effective against ordinary infantry, and that's huge. With combination of Scar Striders and heal, with access to fire magic to clear some kind of cheap infantry spears or halberds, and the fact that ogres have very good ranged options to deal damage in roster, that factions now looks more than solid. They are completely one of the best factions now. That's A1 tier, the second one factions from A1 tier. So, looks like we have reached the last stop on our little journey in lands of the undead. And let's start from the Tomb Kings. Tombs are the same as before. Nothing really changed to them, so it's strong, stable faction, pretty far away from the being called top faction, but it's full meta stuff, it feels quite solid and have very stable plays on the battlefields and can be used on tournaments. For some reason it's not really popular for now, but I think it's still quite good. And from faction that gave birth to Nagash, we will move on to his offspring, Vampires. Despite the nerfs, they are still at the top of the food chain, effective against most core meta factions, and still with an incredibly rich choice of lords and roster. They are probably the strongest faction at the moment, aside from the Chaos Dwarves. But Chaos Dwarves are broken, and last tournaments lot of admins just ban them, so we cannot rate Chaos Dwarves as real faction before hotfix of CA. And finally, here we are, the Grandfather Nurgle, who received a solid number of buffs. He just still remain uncompetitive. Pirates also went to him. Both of these factions have terrible situations in matchups, and if Nurgle's problem is in a poor roster and design, which can be solved with the release of the new DLCs for this faction, the pirates were simply nerfed to the ground or into the deeps, like, pirates. So they just need buffs, because they will not got any kind of DLC anytime soon. Well, this is where we end for today, and just as a reminder, this raids works only for domination, not for land battles. All of this is my personal opinion, and on many points I have questions myself, and I really want to understand a lot of things more clear. So thanks for watching. Feel free to share with your own opinion and comments, and see you next time.